I couldn't wake up in time, so my apologies. So the presentation I'm going to give is about building recovery capital. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what I see as some of the core theories and models. And I think from the discussions I've had with Trevor and with Emma, I hope this fits very well with what you do. As Trevor mentioned, I'm primarily based now at Leeds Trinity University, where I'm setting up the Centre for Addiction Recovery Research. I also work part of the time at the Australian National University and at Eastern Health Clinical School at Monash University. And I'm also the president, as Trevor said, of the Recovery Outcomes Institute. Like all academics, the vast majority of my work is stolen from other people who I admire and who I see as core in the development of the theory. And I mentioned Australian National University. This person is Professor John Braithwaite, who was the founder of the School of Regulation and Global Governance, which is where I'm based when I'm in Australia. And he was originally was the author, he's a criminologist, and originally was the author of an amazing work around reintegrative shaming, about how ex-offenders get allowed back into and reconciled back into the communities they come from. And John Braithwaite's work really has kind of inspired me. So a lot of his work was about restorative justice, and he was involved in the big trials of restorative justice about 20 years ago. But he is, I guess, a champion of the idea that the solutions to long-term problems of addiction and crime are fundamentally social problems. And earlier this year, rather, he published an astonishing book called Macrocriminology and Freedom. And I want to take this quote from the book because this quote really sums up much of my models and theories. So his argument is that social capital, human capital, recovery capital, and restorative capital are unlike financial capital in that they are not depleted through use. When you spend your money from the bank, you deplete your capital. When you trust someone, you do not deplete trust. Trust tends to be reciprocated, and this engenders virtuous circles of trust building. A politics of hope is like a kind of core form of redemption as we face adversity. It's infectious. Now, I'm not going to use the word infection, but I am going to use the same metaphor around the notion of contagion, because it strikes me that what's absolutely central to this model is that building recovery is something that grows over time. And it grows in a complex, iterative, and dynamic way that as people change and recover, what they do is that they are engaged in fundamentally social and societal processes, that their recovery journeys challenge stigma, they challenge exclusion, they lead to new connections. And that what we have is fundamentally a process where and I guess probably the most important thing for me to say is, it's a fundamental reversal of a treatment process, of a treatment model. And people frequently say, why is the recovery model different from the treatment model? Well, let's start here, because where the treatment approach generally assumes that we deal with an individual. We have a pathologized individual with a series of deficits we attempt to rectify with a series of technologies and techniques, pharmacotherapies, psychological therapies. A recovery model operates on a fundamentally different principle. It's not based on a deficits model, it's based on a strengths model. The magic doesn't happen by a therapist sprinkling magic dust on somebody's head and them getting better. It happens in the community through a complex long-term journey of social process. It's fundamentally something that's in the air between people, not something that happens in a body or a head. It's an intrinsically social process, and it's fundamentally future focused. And if we wanted to think about the big differences, the big assumptions, and people sometimes use the somewhat grand term of a paradigm shift, but it's a paradigm shift in those four fundamental senses: strengths-based, interpersonal, community-focused, and social. Those senses, it's fundamentally socially driven. And recovery capital, I think for me, has been I want to take these definitions, the original definition from Granfield and Cloud, and then build on it. So they defined recovery capital as the breadth and depth of internal and external resources that can be drawn upon to initiate and sustain recovery from alcohol and other drug problems. So I think the key here is the internal and external and how those two things link to each other. And I'll come back to the thing that I'm going to talk most about. The thing that fascinates me most at the moment is the relationship between a contagion and a cascade. But I'll talk about how they differ in a second. One of those people, William Cloud, writing with the astonishing William White, argued that stable recovery is best predicted on the basis of recovery assets, not pathologies. And this is a massive challenge for us, because we tend to assume, and in treatment services for years, we've assumed we kind of start with an assessment of everything that's wrong with somebody and we try and annul all of them one after the other. But if we work in a different set of assumptions, that what we're actually trying to do is build strengths, then in essence, what we're trying to do is something that switches that focus. And fundamentally for me, I was doing, well, actually I might be doing a talk today for the European Federation of Therapeutic Communities. And one of the things I think is interesting for them and for recovery-oriented specialist services like rehabs and like therapeutic communities, the challenge, they understand perfectly well that social focus. They understand the importance of both interpersonal dynamic and group dynamic. But the challenge is, how do you translate that if you displace people to create those bridges and links that allow people to recover over time? And I think, you know, for in terms of my own contribution to this debate and this model, essentially what I started with was I combined my work with the work of an American academic called Alexandra Lodi, and we came up with a model of recovery capital. And recovery capital fundamentally as as something that could be shifting. So the first principle was its dynamism. The second principle was that ultimately we are trying to change those personal internal characteristics, the slice of the pie on the screen that says personal recovery capital. But the way we do it is through the other two slices of pie, the social recovery capital and collective recovery capital. In other words, when we looked at the data we had, we found that what are those core personal characteristics? Those core personal characteristics are things like resilience, coping, self-esteem, self-efficacy, communication skills. How do we build them, those enduring things that will allow people to sustain recovery journeys? Well, we build them in two ways. Firstly, we build them through relationships, overcoming either isolation or belonging to groups that are inconsistent with recovery. And I'm not going to make any comments or judgments about good or bad groups, but groups that are inconsistent with recovery. But the other crucial thing is what we originally called collective recovery capital, we now call community recovery capital, which is access to community resources. And effectively, the collective and the social slices of the pie, to mix my metaphors terribly, are the scaffolding that grows around somebody, is built around somebody, that gives them the opportunity to grow and develop those internal personal characteristics. And an American academic called Rudolf Moose described that process as effectively being predicated on two assumptions: social learning, where you watch other people, and the principle is simple, I want what they've got, and social control, which is, if I want to be part of that group, I have to do what they do, or they won't let me continue being part of that group. And that process is a fundamentally socially driven process of change and growth. And for me, you know, the key to this is not to try and talk people into growing personal recovery capital, but to create the opportunity, the windows of opportunity for relationships and the access to community resources. And from what Trevor and Emma have told me, a lot of what goes on in your work is really about that, creating the conditions that allow, that provide the scaffolding around people to change. Trevor said something about academic battles. Well, I'm not really up for academic battles. One, because it's too early in the morning here, and two, because I'm too old and too cloudy thinking for any of that. So I just wanted to draw attention to two papers I've done in the last year or so. one with a colleague from Trinity College in Dublin called Johanna Ivers, called Ink Spots and Ice Cream Cones. And the second with a colleague from Harvard Medical School, Emily Hennessy, called the Science of Recovery Capital, Where Do We Go From Here? And if anyone is interested, I'll be happy to provide them with copies of those papers, because they really shape up two different things. One is the big picture conceptual model, which is the ink spots and ice cream cones, which I'm just about to go on to. And then the much more kind of detailed focused paper of where are we and where do we go up to. So I guess the point of showing this slide is really to say two things. One, that there has always been this idea that recovery is kind of on a wing and a prayer, that we are vague and imprecise in what we do. Well, we're not. The science is growing. And I think the transition from a recovery model to a recovery capital model really is fundamentally an attempt to create a series of mechanisms and metrics that we can count and measure. And those metrics allow us to start charting and mapping that change and transition over time. And crucially for us, it allows us to test hypotheses. It allows to quantify and measure change. And in spite of the fact recovery is a fundamentally internal process, it allows to count and quantify what we do. So part of what I've done over the last 10 years or so is to develop a series of measures and metrics, and respectively in this diagram, within the ice cream cone, they are the assessment of recovery capital, the social identity mapping model, and asset-based community development. Because if we want the little person at the bottom of the cone to grow and develop, we have to recognize the dynamism of the model. That even within my own head, I kind of thought what we're trying to do is to access community resources, support people to belong to positive social groups, and that will then kind of drip down the cone into the into the individual, and they'll get benefit from the resources and assets, which is very much the kind of Bourdieu and Putnam models of how social capital works. But one of the things that becomes very apparent when you work in this area is that's a two-way process. And the arrows on the left-hand side effectively are about, if you do that, you then create new connections, which I guess years ago would have been called weak social ties. And you create new pathways and bridges in communities. And I'll finish on this note. But what I wanted to say is that every time there is a successful recovery journey and a recovery pathway, effectively we generate sprinkles on the ice cream cone. And this is the John Braithwaite point about increased trust and increased engagement. And effectively what that means is it is not a production line of more or less successful cures for people. It transitions individuals who in turn transitions the communities they live in. And one of the things that I think in the last 10 years that has become so encouraging is that the focus of a lot of our attention and work has kind of switched, as academics, has switched from the question about do 12-step group works, or is SMART effective as an intervention, to the question of what do recovery community organizations do, who are visible, who have as their goal giving back to communities, and who are part of that process of physically creating the conditions in which recovery can happen. And I'm going to go back to the last time to John Braithwaite's work, because one of the grand hypotheses in his work, which is based on something we've known for a number of years now, well, about 30 years now, that the overall crime rate globally is dropping, with the exception of some Latin American and some African countries. Basically, recorded crime rates are going down pretty consistently across much of the world. And his argument has been that has been to do with the combination of two factors: effective intensive policing, plus what a criminologist called Robert Sampson has referred to as collective efficacy. And collective efficacy is effectively the extent to which you're willing to intervene if something bad happens to kids in your neighborhood, or how much you'll talk to your neighbors, and will you take in their Amazon parcels when there's nobody else around. And the idea of that is those levels of local connection, collective efficacy, trust, connection in communities lead to cascade effects which lead to crime reduction. In other words, when crime is reduced in one area, the original theories of displacement don't happen. You get a ripple effect, a contagion effect of benefit. And the argument of ink spots and ice creams is that, as you are, and as I can name dozens of fabulous lived experience recovery organisations in the UK, that we don't try and do what we'd have done with treatment. If each ice cream cone was a detox ward, and we did a successful detox ward, we would replicate it. We'd copy it, we'd McDonaldize it, and we'd open half a dozen of them around the country. But recovery doesn't work. Each ice cream cone will be different because it will rely on personal qualities. It will rely on social connections and the assets in local communities. The ink spots are the cascades, because contagion is what fundamentally happens, primarily but not exclusively, as a peer process where recovery transmits from one person in recovery to another. That's the how, and they create clusters, recovery community organizations, mutual aid groups. Those ice cream cones are those clusters of successful recovery endeavor. The ink spots are the cascades, which is what professionals can do to create and support the conditions for the ice cream cones to flourish on an individual basis. Ink spots and ice cream. Okay, I'm now going to go back years and years and years and years to my two fundamental starting points and pillars of how do we support people to recover. So the first of them, which we refer to as the Goya study, was a big study I did in Glasgow and some of it in Birmingham as well, where we basically looked at well-being and recovery, and we found that there were two things that predicted well-being and recovery: more time spent with other people in recovery, and basically the more stuff you did while you were in recovery. So in essence, somewhat to our surprise, when we took account of how much time people had spent on positive pro-social activities, childcare, community group engagement, volunteering, education, training and employment, the sum of that total basically was the single biggest predictor of well-being and recovery. Why Goya? Well, Goya is an incredibly sophisticated scientific term that stands for get off your arse. The more you do, the better you do. And basically, I guess when we published this, people thought this was part of some kind of dubious right-wing neoliberal agenda about force everybody into work the day after tomorrow and no benefits or any of that kind of thing. But it's not. It's basically about the beneficial effects of meaningful activities. And the other challenge, which is a reasonable one, was how do you know it's not the case that people with better well-being therefore engage in more activities? So we did a follow-up study with 3 English drug action team areas, where we mapped out people's activities over the course of a year, and we split them into 4 groups. Were they doing none at the start but initiated? Were they doing some at the start but stopped? They didn't do meaningful activities at any point, or they were engaged in meaningful activities continuously. And what we found was very, very clear. Where people initiated meaningful activities, their well-being in all 3 of our markers, physical well-being, psychological well-being, and quality of life, went up. Where they stopped meaningful activities, they went down. Where people were continuously involved in meaningful activities, they had higher scores in all 3 markers than when they didn't engage in those activities at any point. Now, those were studies in Scotland and England, and then we replicate them with this delightful diagram in Florida. And basically, this is a structured equation model, and the details of the model don't matter really. But if you read this from the bottom left where it says time and residence, effectively you get a standard treatment effect. So this is recovery residences in Florida. The longer people stay in recovery residences, the less barriers there are to their recovery, the less unmet needs they have, and the greater well-being they have. But there is a second pathway to well-being, which if you read up from time and residence, so you still need to spend time in the recovery residence, but you engage in meaningful activities, both your personal recovery capital and your social recovery capital goes up. Basically, spending time around other people in recovery and learning how to do it, accompanied with meaningful activities, leads to increases in personal and social and recovery capital, which in turn leads to increases in well-being. Here's a place that's not normally associated with well-being. This is HMP Home House, the UK's first ever recovery prison, which is in Stockton-on-Tees in the northeast of England, where we were lucky, and I'm just going to spend 5 minutes or so talking about metrics. Well, no more, because I realize I'm running out of time and running out of your time. That basically what we were able to do was to start mapping recovery capital using our instrument called the RECCAP to assess changes in recovery capital over time. And what we found basically, in spite of some challenges of poor engagement of prison officers in the process, was that basically when people entered a recovery environment, we got the same effect: reductions in unmet service needs and barriers to recovery, plus improvements in personal and social recovery capital, recovery group engagement, and quality of life. In other words, those same social factors, those factors are about creating the conditions for social connections to happen and meaningful activities to happen, led to significant improvements in that. We've just published a follow-up paper based in Florida, where we're looking much more intensely now at what happens in recovery residences. And effectively what we have attempted to do is to say, and I think this is really important from the perspective of trying to develop a kind of recovery-oriented framework for things like rehab and detox. But in recovery residences, and for me, it's an absolutely astonishing omission that Britain and Ireland remains relatively weak in its provision of recovery housing, because they are an absolutely critical part of a recovery-oriented system of care. So we were able to do two things with our data. First, we were able to show who stays in recovery residences, and people who dropped out were more likely to be young, female, had less earlier involvement in recovery groups, and who'd had previous complications around housing. But what we were also able to show, again, sticking to those fundamental basic themes, is that for people who were retained, recovery capital growth is associated with employment, meaningful activities, higher levels of social support, greater recovery group involvement. Bizarrely, being younger, you're more likely to drop out, but if you did stay, you were more likely to grow your recovery capital and higher quality of life. Now, what's important here is that effectively we're showing exactly the same twin pillars of recovery growth. You do stuff and you spend time with other people in recovery, and that promotes your recovery journey. Two simple, consistent pillars. And as I say time and again, the challenge is about how do we create the conditions that allow people to benefit from those processes. So the key conceptual framework for me, and I didn't really talk about CHIME in this process, but I'm just going to mention it at the end. CHIME is a model from mental health recovery movement that starts for connection, hope, identity, meaning, and empowerment. And every time I get asked to go and evaluate a recovery initiative or a recovery service, that's what I start with. I start counting, does that service do those things? And if you're involved in evaluating or mapping any of your recovery activities, it's a very quick and simple cheat, because every recovery service will do that. It's about growing recovery capital. And how do you do that? You do that by creating the conditions that allow the process of recovery contagion to happen in communities. And how we do that as professionals is through a process of cascade. We create and allow those conditions, recovery community organizations, recovery residences, mutual aid groups, community-based activities, volunteering opportunities, giving back, that effectively create the conditions for visible recovery champions to flourish, for groups to coalesce around them, and for access to community resources. Now, one of the things I think that has been omitted in this world is we've talked a lot about how we actively promote the growth of recovery champions, but one of their fundamental roles is how they are an effective connector, community connector that builds those bridges, community resources with two goals: to maximize the gain for individuals in recovery, but to create those sprinkles, to ensure the groups benefit as a result. Because ultimately, the test of recovery effectiveness is not just personal efficacy, it is collective efficacy. Can the activities of a recovery community make the community a better place for everyone? And this is very similar to a model that we would have in desistance theory, that effectively one of the things that Shad Maruna has talked a lot about is something called redemption narratives, and the idea of tertiary desistance, which is someone has finally overcome a crime career when society allows them full access to all its resources and opportunities. And effectively, that is about creating the ultimate conditions of collective recovery capital. What we have to think of, and one of the big things of my work at the moment, is to move away from just individual counts of recovery, to start thinking about group and community levels, and by recovery-oriented, by ROSC, we mean recovery-oriented systems of care. So something that I don't think Ireland has yet, and I hope it will have, is I'm lucky to be one of the founding members of the College of Lived Experience Recovery Organisation, CLERO. And I think there's a big thing to think about for you about how do you start trying to map out what are the innovations of recovery organizations, what are the ways they link to each other, and how do we map both quality standards around developing a professionalization of the recovery community. And it seems to me one of the core objectives we have is to create a world where we don't think of lived experience champions or peer leaders. We talk about professionals with lived experience, and that's seen as a valid and genuine component of professional pathways and development. And in my new Centre for Addiction Recovery Research, and I'll finish on this point, in my new Centre for Addiction Recovery Research, one of the things we will be doing is establishing masters in peer-based addiction recovery leadership. And the idea there is to create a pathway for people to significant sustainable recovery. People have talked about recovery-oriented integrated systems in services and treatment approaches. But for me, what we ultimately have to think about is the idea of how do we create the recovery conditions that change both professional practices and change the communities they're embedded in. And I think we should be ambitious in those goals. So just to conclude, I'm exceptionally sorry I was late. I hope some of that has been of interest and benefit to you. And apologies to the organisers for causing them heart attacks and messing up their scheduling. So thank you very much.